G'day everyone, I am the man called Kemosabe, the man with a plan from the land down under, and this is my video on the top 11 things you're probably doing wrong when you're writing your comic. I've been reviewing mainly indie comics for a while now, and reading them even longer. There are some things I see people doing time and again that I'd be glad to never see again on a page, but for some reason writers keep falling into these ruts. I don't know if they see these things and think that they're the way it's done, or if they themselves aren't very widely read, or maybe it's their first time out the gate and they're too timid to try anything less than safe. Either way, here's a list in no particular order. Or what I've heard as the 3 Bs, bed, breakfast and bus. We don't need to know every detail of the character's life. We don't need to know they woke up that morning. If you're alive and conscious, you did that. Congratulations. It's not an achievement. We don't need to know what they had for breakfast, and we don't need to know they took the bus to work. Less literally, you don't always need to start in media res, but it's not a bad idea. I've seen a lot of books where we are subjected to unnecessary details, minutiae and specifics that don't enhance the story in any way. Your page real estate is limited, and every time your reader gets bored or pulled out of the story, that's an instance where their enjoyment of your comic is diminished. Every time their enjoyment is diminished, that's an instance where they reconsider finishing the book, or even worse, buying the next one with your name on it. Now, mundane elements can be used to demonstrate how normal a character's situation is before something amazing and fantastical happens. But if you're doing that, do it quickly, hint at the extraordinary, and get it on the page as soon as possible. One thing I see a lot of is an overabundance of narrators boxes to catch us up or fill the audience in on what's happening. This is the issue with the last point on this list. If you start in media res, or just partway through the sequence of events that makes up the story you're writing, you will need to backfill some information. Who are the characters? Where are they? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? But you probably don't need as much of this information as you think you do. You'd be surprised how much leeway the audience will give you on these things. They don't need to know all the details of why your crack squad of cyber ninjas are breaking into a top secret facility. Just let them know the guys are skilled, maybe even keeping the cyborg thing a secret until later, or revealing it in a cool way that's not a narration box straight up telling you they're cyborgs, and tell them facility is top secret, then get out of the way and let the story happen. Did you ever find out what was in the suitcase in Ronin? No, because it didn't matter. A lot of the details you think are important don't matter either. Most of the stuff you leave out, the audience will fill in with some kind of nebulous feeling they have of what it should be. And just like how the monster at the top of the stairs behind the door is never as scary as climbing the stairs and actually opening the door, any explanation you present will likely fall short. The human imagination has this great ability to imagine, without hard edges, all kinds of fantastic sensations and ideas and notions. If you define everything to the last detail, you rob the readers of that, and probably risk your story straying into too grounded territory. You are writing a comic book after all. There should be some fantastic or extraordinary elements to it, even if it is a story set in the real world. I was looking at an indie comic online the other day, and the first few pages of the preview showed a crack military squad on helicopters preparing to assault the fortress of a big-time international bad guy. As the choppers closed in on their target, the main character, over the next 2 pages, narrated more than a dozen boxes of internal monologue where he tells us that the bad guy killed his whole family at sea and slit their throats and threw their bodies overboard. Yeah, that's his motivation, but it smacks of puppy kicking. Oh, this guy killed my family, so he's bad. Make sure you, as the reader, think of him as bad, all in capital letters. They might as well have had him don a black hat and twiddle his mustache. And of course, since the bad guy is BAD bad, the character opposing him must be good with a capital G. There was no ambiguity, there was no fun either. No wonder, no excitement at what the story could be showing us, what the narrative could be. There was no chance for my imagination to run away and come up with something fantastical. Instead, it was a boilerplate revenge mission, and since it was playing out like Act 3 but I was reading it in Act 1, I knew things would go sideways somehow and set up the rest of the story. I assume. I don't know for sure because I never bought the comic. Those first few narrator-heavy pages were enough to convince me not to purchase the title. It was a shame too because the costume designs are pretty cool. This is probably the most egregious error I see so often in indie comics. Huge flashbacks. I've seen some comics where the flashback takes up 25 to 50% of the total page count. Not once has one of these extreme flashbacks been worth all that dead tree. None of them provided enough motivation, pathos, or character development to justify their size. There's a lot you can do with flashbacks. You can play around with their size and placement, you can come up with some configuration that doesn't have your readers tuning out while wishing for more of the now, more of the hero in costume doing heroic things. The CW show Arrow had a great formulation, where roughly half of every episode was set in the now and the other half was set in the past. But the two linked together, and what events happened in the past had an immediate impact on the present of that episode. The Mel Gibson Maverick movie does the old record scratch, I bet you're wondering how I got here bit. We start the movie with him in mortal danger, then he recalls how he got to that point. But really, we just jump back and watch the events leading up to the now. Gibson's character doesn't narrate the whole thing. He doesn't give us glib voiceovers, and it's not this huge seminal event in his life that motivates his lifestyle. It's literally the 3 or 4 days before the opening of the movie replayed to us. Really, we didn't even need to see him in mortal danger at the start of the movie. They could have just cut that bit out and played the movie in chronological order, but it still works. It grabs your attention more than a slow pan over the dusty plains down into a little western mining town. Simon Portier's Blood Hunt, which I reviewed earlier this year, starts with the main character, recently turned into a vampire, geared up and preparing to assault the stronghold of his former employer who had recently betrayed him and left him for dead. Vincent, the vampire in question, narrates the events, but it's done in a cocky, Duke Nukem over-the-top kind of way that is the signature style of the book. It's meant to be like that. Unless you have a structural reason to include a huge flashback, you're probably better off handling it as dialogue. Again, your readers are cleverer than you think. You can hint at past events and motivations via dialogue without having to spell everything out or include huge flashbacks. A good but flawed example I've used before is the first Tim Burton Batman movie. Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne never speaks out loud about his motivations, about why he is Batman. There is a short, stylish 2-minute daydream where he remembers what happens at night in Crime Alley. You might argue that everybody knows why Batman does what he does. Everyone knows about Crime Alley, the gunshots in the dark, the pearls falling to the alley floor, and that's why Burton could get away with such a small and unexplicit flashback. But those images were crystallized by this movie, the Batman animated series and other media that came after it. Before Batman 88, most people still thought of Adam West when the Caped Crusader's name came up, and as far as I remember, Batman's motivations was never mentioned in that show. So you have 2, possibly 3 generations who only knew about Batman from Adam West and Tim Burton, and for all those people and for all those years, that they only got a 2-minute flashback with maybe 24 spoken words, and that was enough. The issue with agency is a larger one than just in indie comics. Most accusations of Mary Sueism, for example, seem to contain at its core at least some element of the character lacking agency. Agency is the ability for the character to act, to enact their will, to make decisions and have whole thoughts that are their own and generally impact on the world around them. They make things happen, they move forward, they either initiate conflict or respond to conflict with action, be it physical, social or thematic action. To lack agency is to be a bystander, an NPC instead of a fully formed character. Characters without agency just sort of sit around and things happen to them and around them, but they aren't really affected by them. People don't want to read about doormats, they want problem solvers and motivated men and women of action. I see a lot of characters in indie books that just kind of exist, and things happen and they get swept up in the events and they react to things, but it all feels like they're going through the motions. They barely seem to care. They're not invested. So why should we as the reader care? Why would we be invested? A character with agency needs motivation, which brings us to problem 7. The motivation mechanism is what I call a perfunctory event that is added to a story to get the character off their butt and do stuff that we actually want to see. It's the kidnapped girlfriend, the murdered wife and child, the burned down orphanage, the dead parents. Action movies are some of the worst offenders of this, but they quickly hit us with a scene or montage of how happy the hero is with his situation and the people in it that he loves and lives for, right before they are taken, usually violently and forever, thus beginning his quest for vengeance. These were played out 30 years ago and they are much better today. I think the main problem with them is that they're just so expected, and they rarely look any different than they did when Lorenzo Lamas' girlfriend was shot and killed by Jackson from Bloodsport. We don't have enough time or enough real character development for us to care much about these characters. Think about how frequently you see the action hero start the movie with a loved one, and you start an internal timer to see how long that person lasts. We accept it because we know the hero needs motivation, and when you're watching a Van Damme movie, you're there for the action anyway. That's why I call it the motivation mechanism. It's a cog in the machine of the larger story. It's superfluous, easily interchangeable. Probably 2 of the best characters I've seen motivated by revenge into violence are Brian Mills and Eric Draven. Both of these stories handle the character's motivation differently. The first 30 minutes of Taken is a character study. Brian is shown to be mundane, even pitiable. He wants to get to know his daughter and endures the slings and arrows of his ex-wife, who blames him for everything that went wrong in her life. We see him portrayed as paranoid, ignored, passed over, coming in second place time and again to Lenore, her new husband, her daughter, the girl from Neighbours, Holly Valance. That's her name. Even his own friends give him some pity work to get him off the couch and living life again. By the time his daughter is kidnapped in a sequence so real it's legitimately unsettling, we empathise with him enough that we feel his pain, his fear and his rage. When he mercilessly tortures people who look, sound and act different to him, and probably us, we cheer. Or at least I did. Brian has buku motivation. The kidnapped daughter isn't a shoehorn function like it is in, say, Commando. The filmmakers of Taken took the time to make us care about Brian and his situation, so that we are just as motivated as he is, and we share in his victories, setbacks and defeats. When he shoots an innocent woman to get the information we want, we nod. In our minds it's justified. We are so invested in this motivation we overlook what is essentially a horrible crime. In The Crow we don't have long flashbacks, or a long sequence of Eric and Shelley deeply and charmingly in bohemian rock and roll love before horrible men arrive and do horrible things. We get short, sharp, high contrast and incredibly visceral flashes of past events. enough to spark the imagination, enough to fill us with fear and dread and pity at what they went through at the hands of the evil men Draven hunts all night. These flashes, combined with the inner turmoil and barely contained rage of Brandon Lee's performance, has a similar effect as the character study that is the first half hour of Taken. We buy into the revenge trip. We totally believe the motivation of the character. We give him a pass, in our minds and our morality, to do whatever unspeakable and ungodly things he wants to balance the scales of justice. Make me believe your character cares and I will care. Motivate your character and you motivate me, the reader, to keep reading. I keep reading and there's a better chance I keep buying. But if you're not all about selling your book, you probably don't need to listen to writing advice anyway. I'm not saying you need to slavishly apply the 3-act structure or the hero's journey to your every written piece, but you should at least be aware of them. They are the gold standard for a reason. Like any skilled endeavour, know the rules before you bend them and certainly before you try to break them. You can do some clever things outside of the 3 and 5-act structures, but make sure you can walk before you run. I'm not a huge fan of the hero's journey as it is for application to modern storytelling. I find it unwieldy, even if it is seminal. I'd recommend everyone, but specifically new authors, check out the Creating Character Arcs book by K.M. Weiland. It talks about the 3 types of character arcs, positive, negative and flat, and shows how character is plot and plot is story. If you're unfamiliar with story structure and the hero's journey, grab a digital copy of this book for $4 and find an easier, more applicable way to do story structure. Problem 5. Don't forget to brand your character. There's been a big shift away from traditional heroes in media, and I don't just mean white hats and guys in tights. More and more, postmodern cinema, comics, video games and storytelling leans into anti-heroes, or ambiguous shades of grey, criminals and killers who are framed as protagonists, not heroes, because the people they kill are just worse than they are. While I miss the role and impact of traditional heroes, I do appreciate shades of grey characters. If I didn't, I wouldn't be writing any novels or creating any comics. However, your protagonists are framed, unless you're working on some kind of redemption arc or positive character arc, you should try and make them likeable. This can be because they act in a certain way, they share ideals and values with the audience, they are hugely competent and skilled at what they do, even if what they do isn't very nice. In short, we as the readers need some reason not to just care about the character and their motivation. We need to like some aspect of them. It's fine to have a character that is an unrepentant bastard if he does it in a way that we find humorous or if he is eminently cool while doing it. But as soon as you can, you need to brand your character. As soon as possible, have them do something impressive. That could be a scathing retort to a verbal challenge, some mental mastery of a situation, or physical competence. Make sure that thing is something that only they can do, and make sure it's something that speaks to their character. Robert Downey Jr. of late has made a career out of this. The first few minutes of Iron Man are like a music video showing how cool Tony Stark is. People love him despite him being kind of a douche. He's rich, funny, clever, brilliant, and he gets away with being a snarky bitch. We see flaws and realise despite having it all, he has space to grow as a person. As Sherlock Holmes, he uses his insurmountable intelligence to come to conclusions no other man in England could reach. Regardless of his personality traits and quirks, he is portrayed as brilliant and tolerated by authorities because of it. Watson, conversely, loves his friend despite his intelligence. In my own debut comic, The Company Men, Dead, White and Blue, the team leader, Jura, has infiltrated into a tumultuous African nation with the intention of assassinating the dictator who runs the place. Jura uses his ability to manipulate freezing temperatures to murder the dictator, making it look like an act of God. He tells the readers that his superiors will be installing a puppet dictator within hours, but that's not his problem. He's done his job. He's all set to head back to base when he gets a call through. There's an emergency situation that he needs to deal with in another nation. He has to jet set there and engage with a life-threatening situation immediately. We learn from this intro, Jura takes orders from the CIA. He has no qualms killing, and while his act might be justified in some way, he doesn't really care. He kills who he is told to. He shows no concern about dropping everything and travelling to another nation and potentially killing more people just on his handler's say-so. We've learned that he has incredible ice powers, and we now know something about their limits and uses. Combined with the cold-themed visual, Jura has been branded. He is a complete entity, and although we learn a lot more about him as the story progresses, within the first few pages we as readers now know enough about him to make a judgment of the character, and can probably give a basic description of him to a third party. Make your characters likeable, make them cool, make us care who they are, what they do and why. Brand them as soon as possible. It seems obvious, but you really need some feedback on your script. Beta readers are a pretty common practice in the writing community. They're not always easy to find, and some of them are less than reliable, but it's worth the struggle to get that outside perspective, that second opinion. I'd bet at some point every writer feels like a fake, like an imposter, like their work that they thought was so brilliant yesterday is mediocre today. One way to overcome imposter syndrome is to get uninvested people to give you feedback on your book. It might be painful, it might hurt, it might knock you down, but it is 100% necessary. Remember, you are not your work. Your work is your work, separate to your value as a person, as a human being. There are plenty of talented writers out there that are absolute trash fires of people, and many wonderful people who, Well, I'd never suggest anybody not write. I wish everybody could enjoy this crazy, amazing practice of creating fiction with words, but some wonderful people should read a lot more before they start writing. Aside from validation, the idea that yes, your script deserves to be turned into a comic, the biggest takeaway from beta readers should be the presence or lack of what are sometimes called speed bumps. When you're cruising along the highway enjoying the journey, smooth sailing, a medium to long drive can be a great experience. In your own head, music pumping, visiting countless worlds and times as the miles tick by. Then you see a sign, speed bump ahead. Your brain jerks you out of your pleasant euphoria. Your semi-active fugue disappears. You ease on the brakes, slow to a crawl, and tortoise your way over those obstacles. You've lost that feeling, that smooth sensation of speed and clarity. You'll have to build back up to that. It'll take you some time, and it's possible you won't actually get there at all before the trip ends. Reading a book or a comic is like this. A good story will keep you hurtling down the highway of your mind. Every time the story has a speed bump, an inconsistency, an out-of-character action or dialogue, anachronisms, unresearched facts, poor spelling and grammar, is placing a speed bump in the reader's way. If the story has enough of these, the reader might not finish the journey at all, and when the story in question is your story, that'd be a real shame. Get a second, third, maybe even fourth opinion of your script. Minimize speed bumps and streamline your story. Get it validated, shed your imposter syndrome, and make some damn comics. There are a lot of first-time creators that might have read comics before, but they don't know comics. Comics are a rich, deep, 100-year-old visual medium unlike anything else. To think you can take your novel or failed screenplay and single-handedly convert it into a functional graphic novel or mini-series is folly. There is a century of visual elements, shorthand and conventions at play in comic books, and if you just copy what you see on the page without understanding why it's there, what its function is, you're setting yourself up to fail. If nothing else, learn about page real estate. Big events and actions deserve more, if not a whole page. Be wary of blowing out your page count or being too wordy early on and having to cram important events into tiny panels near the end of the story. Not a bad idea to thumbnail the whole book from beginning to end before any real art gets made. This is something I see being done fairly well in most indie comics I review, so this is a caveat. Don't neglect subplots, especially if you are creating an ongoing franchise, and why wouldn't you? If New Pub has shown us anything, it's that series is the most profitable model. You should be setting up some subplots, some slow-burning side stories, in book 1 for them to manifest in books 2, 3 and 4. I do. If you don't want to have that many subplots running, set up one subplot in book 1 for it to manifest in book 2. Resolve that subplot in book 2 while setting up a new subplot to manifest in book 3. I'm a fan of setting up stuff in book 1 that doesn't show up to book 4 or 5 and making the audience think I'm a really meticulous planner and plotter with a long-term vision, which I am. I'm rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer lately, and I've found the team on that show is really good at having season-long running subplots as well as smaller ones from episode to episode. I'm not talking about the big bad of the season or whatever MacGuffin they had to find. I'm talking about the smaller character elements that we're aware of that get handily dealt with in 3 or 4 episodes' time, adding to a character's growth and the overall development of the theme of that season. It's great stuff. If you're struggling with subplots, maybe grab a random season of this show and give it a rewatch with all that spare time you have. But do it with a notepad and pen and see if you can identify the subplots and how they're hinted at, affect the characters, and ultimately how they're resolved. You'll probably be a better writer for it by the end. I know I said this list was in no specific order, but this is one of the most egregious, most common, and probably the most damaging of all the comic creating sins I've compiled here. Far too many comics I've reviewed lack an editor credit. There's a whole generation of creators that are unaware of an editor's role in comics and how different it is to an editor on, say, a novel. Part of the blame rests on the hands-off editing style of Big 2 books for the last 10 years, where people in the editor's chair were too scared to critique or criticise the work of writers and artists for fear of accusations of racism, istophobia and mansplaining. I've said many times before, grab a classic book by big names like Frank Miller or Alan Moore. There's an editor credited there. If these superstars that redefine the comic industry had editors, then you're not too good for one either. There are different types of editors in fiction writing, and there is a lot of overlapping language to describe them what they do. A lot of people think of editors as someone who checks your spelling and grammar, and that's true, except at Marvel Comics where even the editors can't spell. But that's what is sometimes called a line editor, someone who goes through line by line looking for those kinds of mistakes. There are other editors, sometimes known as directional or developmental editors, who look at a story in terms of theme, pacing, content, and consistency. Comic editors are more like developmental editors. When you add the visual element of comics to the text of fiction, you gain new dimensions of understanding, expression, and visual brilliance, but you also have the potential for a lot of problems, whole new visual dimensions for you to screw up in. An experienced editor who has a handle on story pacing, page real estate, and character development is invaluable, and can make the difference between your book looking wholly professional or decidedly amateur. Yeah, they'll check your spelling and grammar, because dropping the ball there is a big hit to your professional appearance, but longer term, talking about the rereadability of your books, or its ability to be recommended to others, its ability to draw readers back in to buy the sequel and the one after that. That's where you also need an editor. Someone who can tell you what ideas work, what's good, but also challenge you so you're not floating in an echo chamber of friends and family who think your work is great, but might be just a little bit biased. There's a bunch of freelance editors out there. A shout out on Twitter will probably get you quite a few recommendations. If you can't find a freelance editor, hit me up and I'll put you in touch with a few people. See if what they do fits you and your style. An editor is your secret weapon, your ace in the hole. Use them, love them, pay them, credit them. So that's the list. I expect there's exceptions to nearly every rule here, of course there is. But as someone who's been reading, writing, reviewing and making comics for a long time, this is what I see. If you're a newer creator, I'd suggest keeping these in mind as you set about on your next title. That brings us to the end of the video. Consider liking and subscribing, comment below. Thanks for watching and I hope you join me on the next video. Take care.